Know Alfredo Corchado, you're in for a ripping good tale tonight and a discussion. As he says, since the election of Felipe Calderon, and by the time the publication of this book came out, he speculated there'd be about 100,000 victims of the violence in Mexico, which includes dozens of journalists. And what his book does is it tells that story inside Mexico, the dark side of politics and violence, but more than just talking about going through the list of names and the journalists and the acts of violence and the victims and the seedy, seamy, ugly side of Mexican politics. What it also is a deeply personal story about Mexico that touches on issues of immigration, personal history, touches on issues of Mexico's changes, touches on the experience of what it means to be an immigrant in the United States and to return to your homeland. And it also just does an amazing job of just developing characters, telling very good scenes, often in a very self-deprecating way. It also talks a lot about drinking lots of tequila. I suppose that has something to do with being both a journalist and being Mexican. But it also reads at times like a spy thriller. It really is a page-turner. And the way you could almost imagine a Le Carré novel written in the same style. So I want to congratulate him on just a really good, fun book to read that tells a very grisly story. And I also want to say one more thing before I give him the microphone. Because what we'll do is he'll talk for a little bit, and then he'll sit down and join our two discussants, Ginger Thompson from the New York Times and Andrew Seeley from the Woodrow Wilson Institute, Woodrow Wilson Center. But I want to say one last thing about it. I think the most remarkable thing that really showed Alfredo's courage in this book, and that really got my attention, is that he talks about how when he was 15, he used to go to school dressed as Miguel Bosé, wearing ballet tights and a half t-shirt and ballet slippers. Okay? A teenager, Mexican-American, in Texas. That's cojones. So congratulations, Alfredo. And I hope they weren't showing in your ballet tights, but congratulations. Thanks.
After that embarrassing moment, I'm not sure how to start. Is there any Miguel Bosé music here? Thank you, Chris. I am delighted to be here and to be at the Council of the Americas. It's a place that promotes dialogue between the Americas and, in this case, Mexico and the United States. So I'm very, very happy to be here, very thrilled to be here. Willa for the support. I don't think Dora B is here yet, but she came up with the idea, and I want to thank her. She was also one of these people who became kind of part of a committee of readers, people who offered to read the book and provided a lot of guidance along the way. I was hoping to get beyond, just Mexicans reading or Americans, but kind of get people from different backgrounds. And Dora is from Hungary originally. I also want to thank David Brooks. He's not here, or maybe he's too shy to show up. But David is the correspondent for La Jornada, who shared my journey since 1988 when we met at a Gobernación covering the Salinas aftermath, the aftermath of the election. And there was this, and I write about it in the book, but there was this guy next to me, red hair, freckles, and at the time I was working for the Wall Street Journal, and I said, we have an exclusive here, no one else is here, just one gringo. And David looks at me and says, ¿Quién es el gringo, güey? It was David Brooks. And also thank Ernie Sotomayor from Columbia University. He actually founded or guided me since I was an intern many, many years ago. When I started my career, I met him at NHJ, in Tucson. But thank you for being here. Laura Vargas, for all the work in Ciudad Juarez, and for helping me continue believing in not just Juarez, but in the story in general. Shannon O'Neill, thank you. Even as Shannon was writing her book, Two Nations Indivisible, she took time to read my book, and will always be grateful for that. Tony from CBS. Hola. Buenas noches. Ginger. I've known Ginger since I arrived in Mexico 20 years ago, no? Baltimore Sun. Many, many prizes later, including the Pulitzer, I'm still touched by your grace and your humility. Muchas gracias. I almost lost it in California last week. I was doing a talk, and so I'm trying to not to get too emotional. But Andrew Seeley, and Andrew's been great. We've been having these caminero moments for years, trying to unmask the real Mexico. And I think it's really an excuse to say otro más, otro más. But thank you for all the guidance, your wisdom over the years. And I'm really thrilled to be in New York because I can finally come and tell my agents at Wiley, the Wiley agency, and the people at Penguin, I'm done, I'm finished. You know, Midnight in Mexico was really conceived here in New York City. My editor, Scott, at the time, my agent, Scott Morris, now he's a publisher, but he actually saw the book, I think, before I even saw the book. But my editors were just here, Jeannie and Jamil, also from Penguin. I'm here tonight with saludos from Mexico City, El DF, the great exporter of culture and humanity, and greetings from El Paso, Texas, the other Ellis Island, this one in the Southwest. I'm here to talk about Midnight in Mexico, but first let me tell you a couple of things. I'm trying to kind of make this light and sort of informal, but I did bring an iPad. So from time to time, I will be glancing. If that's annoying, just say, you know what, just tell us the story, and I will. But before I start, I want to tell you one big confession. So Penguin gives me this incredible opportunity to write this book. And after all the you know, the hi-fis and the drinks and, you know, this is exciting, I come face to face with the reality that I don't know how to write a book. I didn't know how to write a book. And I struggle for weeks, months. I mean, it kind of felt like it was a permanent writer's block. And I kept thinking, you know, what did I get myself into? I mean, how do I save face and tell Penguin? I have no idea how to write a book. So I was doing a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center that summer. And Andrew doesn't know this, but I was having a big meltdown and called a friend of mine, Benjamin Alire Science, a writer, who's just won every award this year, including the Penn Faulkner Award. And I called Ben and I said, hey, help me face my fears. I think Penguin made a mistake. And I don't know how to just call Wiley and say, you know what, we're going to have to give your money back, blah, blah, blah. And Ben would just kind of look at me very casually, and he said, I just have one question for you. And if you know, when you answer this question, I think you'll get a sense of whether or not you have a book in you. But he said, what do you think about when I say the word Mexico? And I thought about it and thought about it, and I said, the rain. You know, the rain. And he says, what about the rain? So I know this is not really a book reading, but I thought I would just give you my answer to Ben that day. And that really kind of set the tone for the rest of the book. Just a couple of paragraphs. Con permiso, Chris and Wilda. When summer rains fall on Mexico, all is forgiven. The raindrops cleanse the metropolitan Mexico City sky, sweeping away the smog that traps 20 million people in a suffocating embrace, bringing everything into sharp focus over the southern edge of the city. Two Hulking volcanoes stand guard. According to legend, they are Smoking Mountain, lying next to his lover, Woman in White. Washing away the smog, the rain reveals them on rare occasions, the same way it swept the desert sky of my Durango decades ago. The cleansing is una limpia, the ancient rite, healing a scarred, misunderstood land, always on the cusp of greatness. A country writhing to free itself from the curse of history and geography. For better or for worse, tucked in the indifferent shadow of my adopted homeland, the United States. The moment of forgiveness is fleeting. The hole in heaven closes. So I start writing, and I'm taking all these napkins, and I'm just, da, da, da. And afterwards, Ben says, this is your book. That what you feel that moment, that's the book. And I'll tell you the other thing, based on nearly 3 weeks of doing this book tour, the big question I get from, I think, everyone, including my mother from the beginning, was, why did you pick Midnight in Mexico? Why did you pick the title Midnight in Mexico? And really what you want to talk about is the possibility of Mexico. And I tell them, to me, it's really a book about love, reinvention, and redemption. And I'll start with the love part. It's really, I think, a poem for my homeland. It's a poem for, in many ways, my family, embodied this evening through my sister Linda, who's here, and who just passed the New York bar. And it's my love for the woman who introduced me to Mexico City, and it's been part of the journey, share the journey as a journalist. Mi pareja, I'm not sure how to translate the pareja, the compañera, it always gets lost in translation. But Angela Cocherga, a colleague, a journalist based on the border and for many years worked in Mexico City. When Carlos Fuentes says that the border is a scar, Angela, you and I think millions more are that wound. It was July of 2007 when a U.S. agent called and told me there was a threat against a U.S. journalist. 3 names came up, and I was one of them. That night, as Angela slept, I kept pondering one question in my head. How did I go wrong? Why did I feel betrayed by Mexico? I wonder whether my mother was right, that Mexico was her burden, not ours. I had so many questions as I stared at the lights of La Torre Mayor building, and the only thing that was clear to me was that it was literally midnight in Mexico. Angela, then and now, you remain the light of dawn, even amid the darkness that fell on our beloved country. And that's really why I picked the title. It's a personal narrative, personal journalistic narrative about a reporter with a front row seat to history for the Dallas Morning News, witnessing the most tumultuous time in his homeland. I'm often called a foreign correspondent, but that's a term that I still wrestle with, because Mexico to me has never been foreign. Mexico has always been personal. I am the proud son of Mexico. I was born in a small little town called San Luis de Cordero, Durango. And like many towns, tradition dictated that our ancestors bury the umbilical cord, a very newborn, to remind us, especially those destined to leave, of a place of first sunrises and sunsets. My father was a bracero, a guest worker, whose sweat, along with millions of other Mexicans, helped change the face of the United States. As a young boy, I didn't even know I had a father, because I saw him once a year. But I always knew that when the fall came, when the leaves started to fall, that a man who I kind of associated with Santa Claus would come and would visit. And he would always stop on his way from Central California in El Paso and buy these Tony Lama boots. So I always saw him as, Santa Claus with a sombrero. And the reason I tell that story is because today, as you cover immigration as a reporter, there are so many young people, young kids, who never really know who their fathers are, because people don't have that come and go, that the circularity isn't there anymore. As a kid, I worked alongside my mother in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley. My father is a bracero. He finally gets a green card, and when we go north, they were members of the UFW, the United Farm Workers Union, led by Cesar Chavez. And I can still imagine my mother, especially here being in New York. And right after Robert F. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy was killed. And there was a radio that she would always kind of dangle on the side. And the words, some people see the way things are, and that's why. I dream of things that never were, and that's why not. Had I not followed that mantra, or my mother's mantra, I wouldn't be here tonight. I did also, give you the dark side. I did drop out of high school. As Chris said, I was 15, big Miguel Bosé fan. And my mother would not give up on me. And I'm the oldest of 9, and she said, you have to get back to school. And I kept saying, well, you know what, this is really my goal. My goal in life is to own a car. And it was a 1978 Camaro with the T-top. You know, I was a huge Batman fan. So my mother, you know, offered me a bribe. She said, we will get you a car, give you the down payment in the first 3 payments if you do 3 things. 1, promise to leave California. Everywhere we looked at, you know, Hispanics were in the fields. They weren't wearing ties. And El Paso was a place where we used to go for Christmas to visit family where we saw people with ties. 1, leave California. 2, get an education. And 3, do not get married until you get an education. So I thought I was in love with the rancher's daughter, you know, and I thought, you know, I'd take the easy way out and marry her, and then someday I would be the mayordomo, the foreman for everyone. So for a week I kept going, you know, girl or car, girl or car. And I picked a car and ended up in El Paso. I came of age as a journalist on the border in El Paso at Freddy's Cafe, just 3 blocks from the International Bridge. And I remember when I told my father, I said, I want to become a journalist. He said, okay, just do one thing. Do not ever cover narcos. Do not ever cover organized crime, because these people do not know the word perdón, forgiveness. So for the longest time, I stayed away from everything. And I was a waiter at Freddy's, and it was an eclectic place. We had smugglers during the week, politicians during the weekend. Francisco Barrio Terrazas at the time was at the National Action Party. We had Hillary Clinton one Sunday, and I, as a waiter, I served her menudo. She was, you know, digging it, I guess, until someone told her what the ingredients were, and then she didn't take another bite. But it was a time, you know, it felt like a people's revolution in Ciudad Juarez. I mean, covering Juarez from El Paso, and you saw the young and the old. You saw people take the streets of Ciudad Juarez, later San Luis Potosí, Monterrey, Guanajuato, and of course Mexico City. I've lost count to the number of times that I have walked back and forth from El Zócalo or the Angel, feeling just a little more hopeful about Mexico's future. And in many ways, it was a family affair. My mother would sometimes walk. I caught her once walking from Freddy's to the bridge and handing out burritos to protesters. And you know, when I looked at her, I thought, oh my God, I hope she doesn't see me, because then people are going to ask you, what's your mother doing here handing out burritos? But she was determined that no protester would go hungry that morning. One other person who would come and go from Mexico City was a guy named Felipe Calderon. Had much more hair, big round glasses. We followed Vicente Fox through the highways of California, and we have witnessed the plight of the people coming close, but not close enough. And yes, in spite of the drug violence today, I will tell you, I remain very, very hopeful about Mexico. Yes, there are times when especially I think with the return of the PRI, that I kind of feel like it's back to Salinas or back to the old PRI days. But I'm hopeful because people are finally laying claim to their homeland. I'm hopeful because of the families, for example, in Villa de Salvarcar, and Laura knows the story all too well, the massacre in 2010 that killed 15 young people. That was, to me, a real turning point. I remember after that massacre, Angela and I were covering that, and people came up to me and said, help us find asylum, help us leave. Andrew Seeley was there that day, that morning, ¿verdad? And so people had the choice to stay or leave, and many of them ended up staying. And I was one person that I stay very, very close with, in touch with, Adrian Cadena. And Adrian, you know, he keeps telling me, he says, we're here in Mexico, we're trying to build community, oftentimes through the blood of our own children. I'm especially inspired by the courage of my own colleagues on both sides of the border. 3 of the Pulitzers this year went to Mexicans. One of them, Alejandra Chanik, who tested Mexico's transparency laws to gather information that led to yet another Pulitzer for the New York Times, helping the big investigation on Walmart. Yet there are also, among the bright spots, there are also looming shadows. Since democracy arrived in Mexico, more than 40, some say more than 100 Mexican colleagues have been disappeared or killed. But for every journalist threatened, censored, or dead, there's 1 or 2 more willing to risk his or her life to cross the border and tell us the story, so that the narratives of thousands of people will never be forgotten. And I know how cynical we can be as reporters, but at times my colleagues, even those in places like Ciudad Juárez, Nuevo Laredo, Monterrey, or Veracruz, seem to be the most hopeful, even more than the very people we cover. Many of them are women who are rising with a voice. I will not be denied. I'm also hopeful because as Mexicans on this side of the border are discovering their political might, they're also realizing that their political power will go further if they reconnect with the land of their ancestors. I arrived in this country when just a few million Mexicans called the U.S. home. Today, more than 30 million do the same thing, and that's 10% of the U.S. population. Many of us live a dual existence marked by a bicultural, bilingual world. Too often, our natural instinct, once you cross that border, is to shut the door on the next generation. Forget where you came from. But whether or not we speak the language, embrace our roots or heritage, whether we are of Mexican descent, white, black, or Asian, there is a growing Mexico inside of us. Mexico isn't going anywhere. The 2,000-mile border will always be there. And I challenge you to think of another country that has more of a daily impact than Mexico. Whether it's trade, bloodlines, food, music, culture, or trade, Mexico's there. As Shannon O'Neill often says, it's our choice whether we make Mexico a problem or a partner. Finally, I would just say my book, Midnight in Mexico, is really about answering my parents' question on why I insisted on returning to Mexico. It's about searching for that flickering light during the darkest times of the night, walking in the shadow of two countries, constantly bickering and blaming one another. It's about believing in dawn and the promise of a new day. Thank you very much.
Great. Alfredo, what we'll do now is have a discussion with you as a participant. So I'll be asking questions, but jump in to talk about the book. And Ginger, I want to start with you. You've covered Mexico for a long time. You just recently had a great piece on sort of the, if you will, sort of the fallout of those who serve as informants in this process. Give us a sense of how, Alfredo's story is obviously very up close and personal, how that sort of illuminates the larger sort of political policy questions that are going on in Mexico.
Yeah, I think the book and it makes several important contributions. Most of them are questions. That's what reporters do. They raise good questions, and he's raised a lot of good questions in this book. I think one of the questions he raises is whether Mexico, whether it's governed by the PAN or the PRD, is ever really going to be able to shed its demons, namely corruption and impunity, government corruption and impunity. There's a really touching scene in the book. Alfredo has covered, well, you said you've known the presidents who've governed Mexico over the last 3 sexenios, right? So for the last 3 sexenios. Four.
Salinas.
And if you read the book, you'll see that he's very hopeful about each president when they're elected. And by the time they're departing, he's very disappointed, just like most Mexicans. And there's this really great scene with President Fox in the book in which Alfredo was the first journalist to interview Vicente Fox after he was elected. And he was very excited about this, tall, strapping man who wore cowboy boots and had slayed the PRI, and like in this very cool moment in which he makes clear that reporters are just humans too. He goes to the interview, interviews Fox, and leaves and calls his mother before he calls his editor. And he calls his mother and he's, saying, Mom, me, the son of immigrants, has been the first to interview this historic president. But then by the time Fox is leaving office, he's on an airplane with Fox. He's on Fox's last trip as president to the countryside, and presidents do this at the end of their terms. And so Alfredo gets a seat on the presidential plane, and he in fact sits next to President Fox at some point on the plane ride, and this once strapping, defiant man is a bit sort of deflated and embattled. And Alfredo sort of asks him, what happened, and Fox kind of talks about, acknowledges in a way that he's he's not delivered a lot of the promises that he made to the people during his campaign. And I don't remember the words, Alfredo, but at some point or in some way, Fox says, you know, this is really hard, this president thing. And Alfredo basically says, you know, what took you so long to realize that? And so it's just this sort of one president after another, one party after another, and the impunity continues and the corruption continues. And it's sort of like, how do you fix that?
I think Fox's response was like, I can't wait to get back to the ranch.
Right.
But does your optimism persist, I think is the question.
It does. I mean, it does. I mean, I think if you look at Mexico in the last week or the last 6 months or the last six years, and people keep asking me, you know, are you nuts? You know, why do you remain optimistic? But I look at it from the last 20 years, and I see a much more open society. And like I said, I mean, sometimes for me the best part of the day is when I wake up and I'm listening to the radio, or I'm reading the papers, and you hear journalists trying to keep people accountable. And I think, you know, that gives me a sense of hope, you know, that although, you know, right now with the return of the PRI, it just, there's a part of me that kind of questions, you know, how much has Mexico really changed? And I think as a journalist, that will be probably the most fascinating question we answer in the next sexennial is, you know, did they change that much?
You want to add something?
No, I just was going to make one more point. The other question I think he raises, which is one you alluded to in your comments, and that is sort of the future of reporting in Mexico. I mean, Mexico has become one of the most dangerous places for working journalists on the planet. Yet it, you know, considers itself this emerging, you know, middle class, free market, you know, country, democracy. And, you know, there are, and I'm sure Alfredo will agree, you know, what he went through is nothing compared to what Mexican journalists face, particularly crime reporters face every day. A lot of them don't get a threat. They get a gunman at the door. And so, you know, the future of reporting, I think, will be an important test to Mexico's commitment to freedom and to democracy.
Andrew, you have a book coming out on U.S.-Mexico relations as well. How does this capture for you sort of the personal interactions, the changes, the dynamic relations that have happened and sort of is expressed through journalist struggles and also the realities on the ground and how the bilateral relationship has shaped that?
No, first of all, I think it's an extraordinary book. I mean, for those of you who haven't read it, I mean, it really is it's a fabulous read as well as very illuminating. I wrote something about the book that I called Hope and Impunity, and I think in some ways those are the two themes that run through it. I mean, it is both Mexico is a country that's just changed enormously in the past 2 decades. I mean, there really is, in terms of a growth of a middle class, in terms of democratic change, in terms of people's willingness to participate, all which Alfredo captures and Shannon O'Neill captures in her book, which just came out as well. I mean, really a country that has been transformed, and there's an enormous amount of hope around Mexico. And this should matter to us in the United States, because I mean, this really means Mexico is a much more confident partner with the United States. We can actually talk about things. Not only do we talk about things in the bilateral relationship, like, you know, drugs and thugs and you know, trade disputes and difficulties on migration, and we've also started to talk about global issues. We've actually started to talk about, you know, in the G20, and we've had, you know, more mature conversations that countries do, in part because Americans respect Mexico more, but in part because Mexicans see themselves as an emerging country in a new way, and that is really positive in people's daily lives, and it's really positive for Mexico as a country. And yet at the same time, there's the one thing holding Mexico back, and it's a subject of a lot of the book, and it's a sense of impunity. And one of the things that's fascinating about the book is Alfredo does it from, I mean, big impunity. You're an American journalist in, you know, Mexico, and someone wants to kill you. Where do you turn? right? But even more so in that he chronicles El Mañana in Laredo, a Mexican newspaper. You know, in the end, Alfredo can get out, though he may choose not to and doesn't choose to at times. But you know, if you're a newspaper, a Mexican journalist, as Ginger said, you know, what do you do? You know, what do you do when you're responsible for other journalists? Maybe if you're the owner, you can get out, but other journalists who can't get out. You know, and so this sense of impunity, this sense that goes from macro to really micro things, and there's a lot of stories in there. You'll find sort of a story actually of Alfredo's driver, for example, who's extorted by the police, but in a situation that it's almost laughable if it weren't so tragic. I mean, it's a scam that's being run by the police. It is if you were to tell it, I mean, we would all probably laugh because it is sort of it's really kind of a down and low scandal. But at the same time, you know, if you are that driver, if you're someone who has barely got into an edge of the middle class, the lower middle class in Mexico, it's the kind of thing which you have no defenses against whatsoever. And so I think this dual sense that Mexico is a country that's really moving ahead, that does have hope, but at the same time, you know, really has to come to terms with some of these demons. And these are obviously demons that we're involved with as well, because some of these issues, you know, particularly dealing with organized crime, are things that have a foot on the other side of the border. And Alfredo has at least one story in there that's actually really shocking about what happens on the U.S. side of the border, actually, where it turns out the border doesn't actually end at the physical border. Some of the things we don't think happen on the U.S. side actually do in terms of threats and in terms of impunity. And I mean, just to finish up, I love the title actually, and I think in addition to the sort of physically, you know, midnight in Mexico, it's also this notion that midnight in Mexico is both the darkest hour, but it's also the change of the day, right? And there's an element of both of those in here. I mean, it's both sort of the darkest hour, some really bad things are going on, but at the same time, there's this sense that a new day is coming. And what that day looks like is going to be a story written by Mexicans. It's a story written by the same people that have changed the country so much over the past 20 years, are also still changing it. And so there's this hopeful edge about a country that's still moving forward, you know, sometimes against enormous odds. People like the folks who lost their children in Villas de Salvarcar, the journalists in Tamaulipas, huge odds, but at the same time, people are moving forward in hopeful ways and are actually getting somewhere. And so there is that sort of sense of a new day coming, though we don't quite know what it looks like.
Can I just elaborate? I mean, I do want to stress that the dangers that we face as American journalists, I mean, really pale in comparison. And I remember right after the threat, we were, Dudley Outhouse, who a friend to many of us, said, look, let's do this dinner and let's show solidarity. And the next day, there was a statement put out by the U.S. Embassy, sort of warning organized crime, not to go after an American in general, but an American journalist. And there was a big sense of anger from my colleagues in Mexico. Not anger at me, but anger at their own government. You know, why can't the government do this kind of protection? I mean, I tell people I was born in Mexico and I still have the nopal en la frente, but I have this U.S. passport. And, you know, oftentimes when I go to the border or places that are kind of dangerous, I always take out the gafete, you know, to say I'm with the Dallas Morning News, and try to show the tip of the passport, the blue passport, to kind of make people think twice. But I mean, I want to stress that point because there are a lot of courageous Mexican journalists who continue to do this, and that's why, you know, when I talk about feeling hopeful, I mean, you see that, and they take an enormous risks. They might write the story, or they might call you up and say, look, help us out with this. We can't tell the story, print the story, but just make sure that you don't contribute to the silence around us.
Alfredo, you talk about how a couple of journalists that you mentioned have sort of made their deal for reasons of risks and threats with the narco traffickers. Give us a sense of sort of what it would be like for some of these people who obviously, you know, for them, they're on the front lines. They may have to sort of, just for reasons of their own, not even their own safety, but the safety of family members, how they navigate that very complicated area.
I mean, the cartels, they're actually pretty sophisticated. In some ways, you know, they're marketing geniuses, and in key communities, they have journalists who become their mouthpieces, their spokespeople. And they target them, and that person's job is to call the key reporters or editors, news directors, and say, you know, this story will run, that story won't run. And so oftentimes when I talk to Mexican colleagues, they say, you know, the worst part of the day is when the phone call comes in, and you question, do I pick up the phone, do I take the call, not take the call? If I take the call, me comprometo. I mean, I am agreeing with them. If I don't take the call, like Ginger says, they may show up at my doorstep and bam. In this case, Ramon Cantu, who's the co-owner, publisher of El Mañana. A lot of the key sources in the book, I mean, they read them for both accuracy and security to make sure that they felt, secure. But I remember on February of this year, for a second there, I thought maybe I didn't have a book because some of them read it and said, you know what, give me 24 hours. Let me talk to the family, let me digest. And they came back and they said, you're putting your name out there, we'll go along with it. Because we're tired of living in silence. We're tired of having to censor what we do, how we live. So there's also a sense of deep, deep frustration, that, again, going back to Gendra's point, here we are 24 years later, since Salinas de Gortari, and the conviction rate is still less than 5%. And I think that was one of the, big motivating factors in trying to tell the story.
Ginger, Alfredo talks a lot about the complicity of the state, certain segments of public officials. Give me a sense, as a reporter who's been on the ground, but also from the outside, how you sort of separate that and sort of keep that without, again, sort of getting caught literally in the crossfire, but also in terms of sort of understanding of the dynamics. And it seems like you never know who's.
Well, I think what you're saying is it's hard to tell who to believe. Truth is a very difficult thing to establish in Mexico, particularly when it comes to organized crime. And, figuring out who is a reliable source, whether or not they're in the government, is a very difficult thing. And so that's why, reporting requires you to talk to a lot of people about the same thing to establish one fact or one anecdote or a theme. And so I think Alfredo gets at that very much in the book. This just sort of what a lot of us would call a spokesperson if we were in the States, although I don't know, Washington is a difficult place to work these days too, and to figure out who's telling you what. But I think it's particularly difficult in Mexico because government corruption is so pervasive, and it's not always clear whether the sources you are speaking to are representing the government or representing someone who is someone from organized crime who is representing themselves as a government person. And so it's just a lot of digging.
Yeah. Let me ask a general, then we'll open up for questions. But I guess for all, we'll start with you, Andrew. So what does this mean? Well, let's take the first question in terms of the change of government in Mexico. What will this mean for impunity? Do you think there's a lot of speculation, as you implied? Does it mean with the turn of the PRI, it's going back to Salinas de Gortari? And what does that mean for U.S. policy? In terms of, there's certainly a shift in the security policy of this administration. What does that mean for the United States?
Well, I think on the first part of that, I think the return of the PRI is a mixed bag, and I think we have to see what events on the ground tell us. The PRI historically has been a party that is somewhat more skeptical of pluralistic democracy, accountability, transparency. There's Luis Rubio is fond of saying that the three parties in Mexico all have a different vision of the democratic transition. For the PRI, Mexico's always been democratic. For the PAN, there was a democratic transition in 2000, and for the PRD, it's never happened. And so in many ways, people of the PRI see we've always had democracy, we've always had elections. That's it. So it could give us some skepticism, right? This is not the party that led democratic change. That said, this is also a party that is deeply sensitive to public opinion. And there are also signs, I would say positive signs, that it's a party that has actually picked up a lot of subjects of democratic demands, from victims' rights to judicial reform, that could be very positive, moving towards to transparency, because they are public demands, and it's a party that wants legitimacy, that's coming back, that knows it has a legitimacy deficit, especially with sectors of Mexican society, and really wants to pick up and run with these topics. And so, part of what you hope in a democracy is not that your leaders are virtuous, but that they're accountable. And we can hope that there's a virtuous cycle in place where governments need to gain legitimacy. And let's hope, I have some hope that that process is working, regardless of whether the PRI or the PON or the PRD is a better party, and I think they all have good and bad to them. I think there's something about the fact that citizens are more skeptical and more willing to hold their leaders accountable, even with all the deficits that are there for this happening. And I think with the US, part of what's going on is that there is a realization that Mexico has to get its act together on some of these issues dealing with organized crime. I think over time there will be closer collaboration than we're seeing right now, only because both sides have part of the information. But it's also not unhealthy that the government is saying that this is an issue we really need to deal with, and we need to deal with it for Mexico and for Mexicans. And by the way, in the US, you guys need to deal with this as well on your terms and on your side of the border. And then I think there'll be a convergence over time in a strategy, but there's a moment right now of actually, particularly on the Mexican side, saying there's some things we really need to do. And it's not because Americans are using drugs and they've created a problem for us, because we haven't really kept our own house in order. And that's actually healthy in some ways.
Andrew, I'll ask you first, and we'll let Alfredo answer.
I don't know that I have much more to add than what Andrew said. I mean, except that I think that the PRI has always been a party that is very sensitive to public opinion and public perception. That's why I think they were able to hold on to power for 70 years. But whether they address public concerns in a democratic way or an anti-democratic way is sort of what remains unclear. And, I tend to not predict. I mean, I think I've learned as a reporter that I just don't know which way this government is headed. I mean, they've certainly done some interesting things, but I'm not sure exactly, how far these things will go, whether they're symbolic measures or whether they are measures that are really going to, structurally change the way the government works, the way the government relates to its people, the way the government prosecutes crimes. We haven't seen enough to know yet. And we've certainly seen a lot of the old PRI to still be somewhat skeptical.
I think they've been very smart about downplaying expectations, especially when it comes to violence. And Peña Nieto, the new president, has been very good about telling people, give us at least a year. But as far as kind of the mood as a journalist, there is a sense that they're trying to change the narrative, trying to change the storyline. And then let's focus a lot more on the economy, which is very legitimate. I mean, oftentimes as a reporter, I feel like I'm covering two Mexicos. The prosperous part of Mexico, the El Bajío, the central part, but there's still the other Mexico that's there, and you have to face that. When I talk to government officials, I say, look, I get it, I understand, and I think there's also fatigue among readers on both sides of the border who want something else. But what do you do about the whole impunity? I mean, can you really find peace without justice? I think that's really at the heart of a big part of the whole debate.
Great. Let's take questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes, let's say. Introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Dan Wilson. Look forward to reading your book. Thank you. Seems to me that there were two issues in bilateral relations on security that the last Mexican government of Felipe Calderon would have been very frustrated on, which is lack of U.S. action on gun trafficking and lack of U.S. action on bulk money transfers, or just following the money. Do you see yet any change in sort of that bilateral relations, any hope that maybe there'll be a constructive change in the dialogue in terms of being able to address those kinds of bilateral security issues?
I'm just thrilled to be next to Andrew Seeley. And one of the challenging things as a reporter is to answer policy questions. But we have one of the leading scholars here, Andrew.
That was so kind, Alfredo. I think my take would be on money, yes, on guns, no, which is I think we've actually gotten better in the U.S. at going after the money trail. There has been an attempt both to deal with systematic abuses in the banking system, which in the case of the banking system is arguably sort of lack of controls, but nonetheless looking at the holes that were there. And they do seem to have actually put more resources on the money laundering side. And I think that actually may lead to some interesting new developments over the next few years. The gun side, I think we're going backwards, to be honest with you. There's a lot of things that the White House could do on guns. I think they are still hoping that with some Republican leaders they can reach some advances legislatively. And unfortunately, the one sort of attempt to do something that was actually smart on guns went south very badly, which was Fast and Furious. I mean, which actually was an attempt to really go after people who are higher level. The one thing that can be done within existing laws without going the congressional route or some White House, and Justice Department memos, they could do some things actually outside the legislative arena with executive action. But other than that was Fast and Furious, and I think that was done so badly that I think it, to pun badly, I think left them gun shy about doing more. So I'm not sanguine on guns. I think money laundering, we may see some movement.
Other questions? Steve, introduce yourself.
Steve Handelman. Alfredo, you mentioned, just as part of your description of yourself, that your situation as Mexican American and covering Mexican issues has changed considerably with the change in the demographics of the U.S. 6 million Mexican Americans 30 years ago, 30 million today. So I'm wondering how that's changed your own approach to reporting, and as well whether it's changed as well how Mexican journalists cover the U.S., whether that's made any impact at all on how the U.S. is being covered today.
It's been interesting doing this book tour, and you have sort of different audiences, right? Texas, for example, they were very concerned. I mean, their issues was the I-35 corridor, the drug smuggling, some identity issues. But California was very heavy on identity. Who are we as Mexican Americans? Where are we going, and what can we do for Mexico? I mean, it's been fascinating to have people come up to you and say, you know what, I'm reading your book because I want to connect with Mexico again. I stopped speaking Spanish, or I never spoke Spanish, and I feel this need to try to, feel a sense that it's okay to be Mexican. I mean, one of the most moving moments was, two young women come up to me, and they asked me to sign the book, and they just started crying, and I have no idea why, but I started also tearing up, But they said it made me feel proud to be Mexican, and I don't really speak Spanish. It's interesting how the foreign ministry started this many years ago, trying to build a bridge through Mexican immigrants in the U.S. And it's been interesting to kind of Woodrow Wilson, the State Department, I guess unofficially, right, the State Department, trying to do the same thing, build this bridge of understanding, kind of like the Irish immigrants have done in the past, or the Jewish immigrants. So that's I think one of the interesting stories to kind of watch unfold as the population, the demographics continue to change in the U.S.
The questions? Yes.
Hi, Alex Rossi, and I look forward to reading the book as well. I wanted to pick up on your point about the two Mexicos. As someone who works and essentially lives full-time in Mexico, working in the financial world, I encounter that all the time in terms of the prosperous Mexico and then that other Mexico. And I'm curious, and there's no right answer here, but how is that, the fact is that whenever you are living it in Mexico, you feel that prosperous Mexico, especially right now, Mexico is hot, and it had been under the Brazilian light for a while, and now it's emerging. I'm just curious because when you are anywhere outside of Mexico, all everyone refers to and knows about is that other Mexico, the one that nobody else wants to talk about. And the answer is always, whenever I get asked the question, the answer is always, well, that's the other Mexico, the one that I don't really come into contact with, or the one that's happening on the border and stuff. Is it just inevitable that it continues to have that dichotomy, or is there a time when you believe it'll merge into one, or the dialogue will really change the way the current government is trying to change the discurso, as they say? I'm just wanted to sort of play that out a little bit more.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I go to a place like El Bajío, and there are people, making airplanes, this big giant aerospace, the auto plants. Let me just give you, at one point we had the largest U.S. bureau of anyone in Mexico. We had 12 people. And so we could kind of cover all these things. We're down to one, and that's me. I was just in El Bajío recently, and for the first time, I guess you talk to people about, do you want to migrate to the United States like other generations? There's one labor market between El Bajío, Central Mexico, and North Texas. So we're always interested on future migration trends. And it's interesting how people say, yes, I want to go to the United States, but more out of curiosity than necessity. And that gives you a sense that, yes, the wage disparity will always be there, I think, between the United States and Mexico. But people, I think, in that, at least in that region, see a more prosperous future. And I think that's, I kind of applaud that they're challenging us, the government and others, to try to cover the other story, because that has been an unreported story, an untold story, at least by us at the Morning News, and I take, responsibility for it. So I do welcome that to try to continue telling these other stories. You're right. I mean, one of the things, again, about this book tour is people come up to you and say, so I can actually go to San Miguel de Allende, can I go to this, can I go to that? And they won't chop my head off, And so you also want to take the opportunity to try to tell people, look, Mexico is not all awash in violence. I mean, it's really two countries in many ways. I keep telling people, here's my card, and if you go to Mexico, let me know, and if anything happens, I'll go and rescue you or something.
That's not going to really do the trick. But yeah, hopefully. Actually, I want to ask the other panelists this too, because I think it's a very relevant question. You think about, granted, Mexico is so bifurcated in the way we talk about it, the way we understand it, and even in the society itself, but we'd never sort of, other countries, even say Argentina, we'd never talk about it in that way. Ginger, I mean, how do we get it? And yet you do have the two articles. I mean, we always see the two stories, the aeronautics industry in the north of Mexico, and then you see the immigration story. When does this begin to converge into a less of a two-sided story and more of a unified story? Can it?
I'm not even sure I agree with the premise. I think that,
You don't have to.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think all of us have shorthands for countries. The United States and Mexico, Mexicans see the United States as a super prosperous country. They don't really know the other United States either, which is not a very prosperous United States. But that being said, I agree. I lived in Mexico City many years, and when I had grown up on the border, when I got to Mexico City, I was like, I don't even recognize this place. This is not the Mexico that I grew up. I would say Mexico is three countries. It's the northern border, the central, and the southern border. I mean, southern Mexico is more like Guatemala than it is like Sonora. And so it's just a very, and the United States is a very, patchwork of countries. That said, I do think that if there has been a focus by the media on the crime problems and the organized crime problems, it's because, the media, we cover problems. We cover them in the United States, we cover them in China, we cover them in Mexico, and this is a big glaring problem. And so while, yes, Mexico has made great progress and those stories are valuable and I think important, really important, I don't think that takes away from the importance of this horrific violence that left large swaths of the country in the hands of organized crime. And so, striking the balance as a reporter, one reporter for an entire news organization in a big country like Mexico, you got to pick your story. And so sometimes, you pick the problem. And so.
Yeah. I mean, I just add, we talked about the aerospace industry in Querétaro. And I mean, I think the security threatens whatever economic potential that there is in Mexico. Querétaro has been such a success, successful story. They try to replicate that in Zacatecas, state of Durango, my native Durango. And they were telling me, within weeks, you had organized crime calling you and trying to extort you and trying to do this right. So they shut down. So yes, I mean, I agree with Ginger. I mean, it remains a huge, huge problem. And I get it when people say, but look at all the economic prosperity. Look at this. I agree. We should be doing more. But I think as long as it's there, I mean, security situation is there, it's going to come back and bite you.
And it's also a question that, that involves both countries. I mean, Mexico's security, has a lot, has great implications for America, for the United States, and the United States security. And so, when I was in Mexico, immigration was the big story, and I wrote a lot of immigration stories, and now it's coming back to immigration again, which is a huge story, and another great sort of, question and point that Alfredo's book raised, which is, how the border is not a line, it's a region, and it's bound together by blood and economy, and those things are hard to control and certainly hard to legislate around. And so, I just think, you're writing for a U.S. audience in a foreign country, and it's, picking your story.
Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I agree with Ginger. I'm not sure. I mean, there's always sort of, people who are doing better and people doing worse, whether in this country or in Mexico. In some ways, even the poor in Mexico have done slightly better in the past few years. But it turns out that even the rich are vulnerable to some of the questions of impunity. What there is different levels of vulnerability going on, right? I mean, if you're wealthy, you still have to deal with some of the kind of daily, there's still lines you can cross and really get in trouble. In small things and in big things. I mean, small things from, just simply, trying to deal with government services to big things like really stepping over the line and being under threat. But you have more ways of getting around it, right? I mean, more chance you can leave the country, more chance you can hire private security, more likely you live in a place that you're protected. So there's different levels of vulnerability. And I couldn't help think when you were talking of the first place I lived in Mexico for 3 years was a low-income community on the outskirts of Tijuana. And, I went back there, I go back there pretty much every year, but was back there with a family that I've known for 20 years, and not about a year ago, and drove through, they had lived in the poorest area of the neighborhood, and drove through it and was amazed. I hadn't been to this section of the neighborhood in years. And there were 3 supermarkets. This was all dirt roads 20 years ago, no electricity. I remember when my friend moved out there actually and was sort of, someone I had seen growing up, was very concerned. This place had actually become a real community. They live on a nice dirt road, but it's connected to everything else is decent roads around there. We're having dinner, the kids are playing on a computer next door. This is a working class family. Wow, now granted, it's Tijuana. Tijuana is better off than if you're in Guerrero or some places, but nonetheless. But at some point in the conversation, I'm thinking this is a family that's really moved up, and they have. And they have aspirations for their kids that they never could have had. But at some point in the conversation, it turned to the question of violence. And I asked, my friend's husband, have you run into has the violence been an issue for you? And he said, no, not really. A half hour later, we had discovered 5 people he knew had been killed. And it just went after. Now, he works in an occupation that brings him into some contact with us, but nonetheless, sort of and he finished the half hour by saying, but now it's much better. Which it was, the violence had gone down slightly, but it was also this sense, I mean, I guess the reminder for me on this is, Mexico is moving forward, and it really is, but at the same time, there's this other thing out there which touches people's lives, and it touches them differently. Right? I mean, for people who have greater possibilities to escape from it, you're still never away from it, but you have many more ways of protecting yourself. And if you are sort of in their world, which is transitional, where they're actually moving up but are still very vulnerable, it's different. And if you're in a rural community in Guerrero, it's still different from that, right? The vulnerability is even greater, and so the vulnerability is a real question.
I'm going to allow 5 minutes just to take a bunch of questions since we... So if anyone has a question, raise your hand now. We got one right here. Okay, now everyone raises their hands because I've given you a time limit.
My name is Jim Perez. I'm also reconnecting with my Latino background in a lot of ways. So a forum like this is a real eye-opener for me. Not knowing very much, but just from general reading of newspapers over the years, Colombia obviously was a real mess, for lack of a better term, 20 years ago. It's somewhat very, very different now, I understand. What parallels, what lessons, if any, can be drawn from how they managed to emerge from their midnight in Mexico's instance?
I'm going to take a bunch of questions. This gentleman right here. Actually, Julia, you can, and then we'll get to you, sir.
Hi, how are
The microphone
you?
was close to her. Rich. Go ahead.
We
ahead.
good? Yeah. Alfredo, thank you for writing this very, very important book. I know you can't advocate political policy, but I do think you can advocate on behalf of our colleagues in Mexico, and I'm wondering if you have an action plan or what you would call on the people in this room to do for our colleagues who are still, I think, in tremendous danger. I'm a little concerned that the violence is not front page news anymore, but that our colleagues are still at tremendous risk. And so I wonder what you would recommend that we do to keep this issue front and center.
Great. Question right here, Rich.
Yes, this is Vito Chevarria from Cuban News in Washington. I was going to concur with the gentleman behind me here. I was going to ask the question of the situation in Colombia. You know, back in the late 80s, throughout the 90s, you did have that cycle of violence going on. You did have the cartels back then, and obviously the situation is no longer the case. So are there lessons to be learned from the situation in Colombia that could be applied toward resolving the situation in Mexico today?
Last chance for questions. Got one. Okay, Judith.
Is it
Introduce yourself. I know you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Judith O'Neill. Is it underreporting of the violence or lack of visibility in the United States and in investing countries of the violence? Or is it simply a tolerance of the impunity of violence in the investment community that allows for investment to continue to go into Mexico in fairly significant levels, notwithstanding the violence? Is there a point at which one will stop the other?
Great. Well, there we have the questions. What I'm going to do is actually have them answered in reverse. I'll give you the final word, Alfredo. Okay. So, Andrew, why don't you start?
I think one thing on journalists, being the only non-journalist but I would say is also keep mentioning it to our Mexican colleagues in the same way that they should keep mentioning our drug habit to us. Even if it is a delicate subject, they should call us to the mat for our policies, and we should remind them that we care about this. It's healthy that we have these conversations. And I would just leave it there, particularly with Mexican government officials in the same way that they should with American government officials. Remind us, though we've sort of moved beyond that as a public sort of calling names, we should keep talking about it. On violence and investment, you know, there's a bit of good news and a bit of bad news here. You know, violence has probably stabilized. It was getting really worse very quickly for a long time, depending how you measure it from either 2003 or 2005 on. It was going up at a really rapid rate, and then it leveled off in 2011. And we don't really know if we can trust the statistics, but there are lots of statistics that seem to coincide that it's at least leveled off, maybe dropped slightly and sort of plateaued. There's good news and bad news there. The good news is some things have worked. There are places that probably a mixture of good policing, civic action, and people holding the government accountable has actually worked in some ways, at least partially. Bad news is there also may be a new equilibrium emerging here, right? Where the violence level is not going up, it's not front page news here or in Mexico in the way it was before, and it kind of becomes tolerated at a high level equilibrium, right? I mean, violence continues at a rate much higher than it was. It's no longer drives the news cycle, but it continues to affect people, and in some parts of the country much more than others, and in very dramatic ways.
I don't know that I can really answer any of those questions. I mean,
You don't have to. Pass. You saw Alfredo did it very artfully.
Okay.
It was really...
Yeah, I think I will pass. Let me just think. Yeah, I'm going to pass.
Okay. So do you want an emergency line? Like you can just call?
Right? No, don't call.
Lifeline? Okay, no, go ahead.
I mean, at least in the Southwest, we've been, I'll take the journalist question. I mean, Julie, I mean, in the Southwest, I think there's been a lot more solidarity that we've been building over the last few years. And I'll point out the Knight Center out of UT Austin. A few years ago, we built, what do you call it, a website? Where we invited, I think it was 20 journalists from Mexico, from key areas, key regions that are under a lot of risk, and journalists from the United States. And since then, we keep in touch with one another. I mean, something happens somewhere in Coahuila or Sinaloa, they alert us, we alert everyone, and we're there for one another. And you know, in La Cantina, in La Condesa, we're trying to do a bigger effort to try to build solidarity with our colleagues there, you know, try to bring them in. I always find it fascinating how, as foreign correspondents, we really haven't done more to try to build bridges with our Mexican colleagues. And we're doing a lot of that now. I mean, we just had a reception, if you will, a few weeks ago. We invited the Mexican colleagues to come, celebrated their awards. Sandra Rodriguez is going up to Harvard as an EMID. Marcela Turati, you know, big awards. Alejandra Chanik. But it was interesting to get all these Mexican colleagues there. This weekend, I'm flying back, Angela and I are flying back to San Antonio. There's a big IRE conference, and they're inviting a lot of the Mexican colleagues to come. So I think it's just over time, and we're building solidarity with one another, and we're trying to, you know, build bridges of understanding. And I can't underscore the point that Ginger made earlier. It's you know, whether it comes to sources or colleagues, I mean, I think there's a big need to try to build trust on both sides, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
Let me just ask one pointed question on this, abusing my role as a chair. You talk in the book about how Tony Garza, the ambassador at the time, had spoken out about this. Does that help or hurt when the U.S.?
That morning when I heard it and we were heading to the airport, I wasn't sure. Yeah. And I was really kind of nervous about it. But I think the fact that he spoke up, the fact that he put a press release out, and that they alerted Los Pinos, I think in the end it really helped. Okay. And I mean, again, it was interesting to kind of get the sense from my colleagues, like, why would they do this for an American correspondent or foreign correspondent and not for a Mexican journalist? And that, I think, has stayed with me since.
Yeah, I think that's valid. Well, there is a reception. I wish there was a mariachi band for the occasion, but there is a reception. Books are for sale. Miguel Bosé, yes. Alfredo will be here to sign copies of the book. I encourage you to buy it. It really is an excellent read. So please join us in thanking Alfredo and the two panelists.